All right, guys, so here we are getting ready to dive into oddly which is one of my almost guilty pleasure movies of the past. Well, I almost said of the past couple of years. I guess I'm turning into you, man. So we're talking about a 2002 movie this time, Ghost Ship. It is one of those movies that has, I think, somewhat of a following to it, but it's one of those movies in the horror community that you either love or you hate. I don't know if there's really a middle ground for this one, but we're gonna dive right into this one, and we're gonna talk about Ghost Ship.
When you first showed me the picture of the VHS cover that you had picked up, I was thinking Ghost Ship. Well, I mean, the cover art, the shows like the front, the sternum or whatever they call it, the front of the ship, and like a skull kind of superimposed into it. And I was thinking, oh, that must be like an old 80s horror film or something. Because, back in the 80s, like the box art and the cover art and the posters and all that for horror films was always really cool. And they had stuff like that. So I was like, oh, okay. And then I started to think, wait a second, I think I saw that more in later on, and then did a little research, and yep, you're right, it was a 2002 film, which kind of surprised me. And then I remembered, I remember way back when renting this movie when it first came out and watching it then. So this was the second time probably I've seen it, because I don't think I saw it more than once. Here we are back into the 21st century, which is kind of odd for horror heads.
Yeah, this is one of those movies. I don't remember the first time that I saw this one, if it was on cable or if it was one of those ones. I don't think that box art would have been enough to, back in the early 2000s, where I'd have been like, oh, cool, a ship with a skull kind of on it. Yeah, I got to rent that to see that. But I remember seeing it early on, and then the opening scene of this movie is one of my favorite scenes of all horror movies when it comes to kills. And if you're not aware of the term slide kill, it's not in reference to somebody going down a slide and dying as they're going down. The term slide kill is when something is sliced and then part of whatever was sliced slides off. And the opening scene to this movie gets referred to as a bunch of different things. And it actually is one of those scenes that makes it onto a lot of best of kill lists. So whether it's best slide kills or best massacre kills or best group kills, whatever the case might be, there's essentially what it is there's this ocean liner and there's a giant group of people on this deck of the ship, and this cable gets pulled taut and it cuts through the entire crowd of people and essentially cuts everybody in half except for one little girl. And so you see all of these people fall apart, essentially, which is pretty cool. And so that's one of the things that I always think of, and when I think of this movie, and I always hear of, and I see on, whatever YouTube lists or articles or whatever the case might be, and Ghost Ship always comes up, and it's like, oh man, I love that scene. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because you told me I think you sent me a text saying oh, the opening scene to this film is great, and I was like, oh, okay. And then when I watched it, I'm watching it and I'm thinking, okay, so it's a girl singing on a ship, bunch of people, a bunch of people in suits kind of dancing and all this. I'm like, what's so great about this scene? I was like waiting and waiting, and then all of a sudden, yeah, you see the scene where the rope comes or the cable gets cut or whatever happens, and it slices everybody, and I'm like, oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. I was kind of concerned for a minute. I'm like, I don't know if this is like, I don't know if we share the same type of taste for opening scenes at this point, because it was just, yeah, it was literally like just some like old school singing and all that. And then, yeah, but then it became a horror movie pretty quick.
Yeah, and the other thing that can throw you off with this movie is the very opening where the music is all kind of like that light jazz kind of whatever house musician type of music. And then even at the very opening when it does the title scene and it's like Ghost Ship and it's like written in like kind of like bubbly letters and stuff. And you're kind of like, wait, am I watching an episode of Love Boat? What the hell is going on?
Oh, Love Boat. Yeah, absolutely. It really felt like that. It's funny you say that. That was like the first thing I thought, like, did they remake Love Boat in 2002?
And this movie, too, is one of those that I've heard it referred to a lot of times as the horror Titanic, which was a couple years. I mean, it's more than a couple years. I mean, this was like 5 years after Titanic came out, so I can't imagine that you finally won the pitch in some horror, or the pitch in some executive's office. Like, hey, so I got this great idea. We're going to make a horror version of Titanic 5 years later, and the guy's like, yeah, let's do it. But this story actually has been around. The script for this came out, was getting bounced around like in the mid 90s. So I always kind of wondered if this isn't one of those things that people heard that Titanic was being made, and so they're like, oh, let's go off of that and let's make a horror version of that. So I guess that's always a possibility.
Yeah, I honestly never thought of that. But yeah, you're right, because Titanic came out, 97?
Yep.
Somewhere around there?
Yep,
okay.
1997.
Interesting. Yeah, probably, because you think about it, ultimately speaking, I know we don't like to say this, but the movie industry is a business, and it's all about money, and it's all about getting people in the seats to see these films, so there probably was a connection to that.
And this came out in 2002, and this was just after the horrible debacle that was 90s horror. And this had, well, it didn't have some of that, the exact feel of some of the 90s horror. It did have the feel of some of the big budget horror of the time, whether it was in the 90s or even some of the stuff in the early 2000s. Because one of the things that this movie did have was, while I wouldn't say that anybody that was in this movie was a big star, there was a lot of recognizable faces that were in it. You had Gabriel Byrne was in it, who, if you're a fan of, other suspense movies and horror movies at the time, you know him. He was in End of Days with Arnold Schwarzenegger. You had the girl from ER, I think was the name of that show that she was in. So a lot of people, which was a popular show at that time, so a lot of people were like, oh, hey, that's Abby from ER. Which is kind of weird that I know her name from ER, but I do. And then you had Ron Ingold in it, or whatever his name was, and he was another one of those guys where, he's one of those guys where you're kind of like, oh, hey, I know that guy. I've seen him in something. So you had a couple of those recognizable faces in it, but, there was no George Clooney or Brad Pitt or anything in it, of course. They had that kind of going for them. It's kind of weird. This movie is one of those movies, like I said before, it's one of those movies you either love or you hate. And if you actually look at Rotten Tomatoes, I think this has like a 14% on Rotten Tomatoes or something. I mean, it's super low. This whole movie is kind of one of those movies that you've seen the story before, like the overall aspect of the story. It's not something that's brand new. It kind of has that weird feel of some similarities to like a horror Titanic. So basically, what it is you have these. They're I don't know what you'd call them, sea scavengers or ocean scavengers. You know, at the beginning of the movie, they are bringing this salvage ship in to some port from somewhere that they, raised from the seabed, and they're at some bar doing this whole celebration scene, which again, we've seen in other movies from the time period, not necessarily horror movies, but it always the bar scene always reminds me of like Armageddon or something along those lines. You have these guys like, hey,
Yeah.
you guys are the best in the industry. I need you guys to come and do this job that nobody else can do for me, kind of a thing. And so anyway, so this guy comes and approaches these sea scavengers and says, hey, so I've seen this ship like floating in the ocean. Can you guys come and help me? And so they're all like, yeah, let us talk about it. And, of course, the one guy's like, well, it could be a complete bust, or it could be worth millions. And so they're all like, oh, hell yeah, let's do it. And so, of course, they agree to it. And so then, it starts this whole ghost story. So they go out to sea and, they're doing this whole, again, kind of like an Armageddon type feel to it, to where they're like, partying, and you have the girl amongst the crew, and they're all like, oh, and she's all like, well, I'm a badass just like everybody else. And then, of course, they come across the ship, and it's this gigantic Italian ocean liner just like floating out in the middle of the sea. Come to find out, of course, the captain of this little scavenger boat, he knows all about it. He knows the whole story and stuff. So he's kind of telling them. And so then they board, and turns out it's haunted. And then, one by one, everybody's picked off. And then the only thing I didn't like about this whole thing was, so you have this like ghost story going on, but then at the same time, they throw this, oh, well, the ship was hauling this load of gold across the ocean. And then you had these like mobsters on board that were stealing the gold. And it's like, what? Well, that was kind of unnecessary.
What did you think of the end? The little twist ending, or whatever you want to call it?
Well, I think that was kind of expected at the time. I mean, there was no way you were going to have the end of a horror movie that wasn't setting it up for some sort of sequel. Even though, like, the sequel is like, oh, wait, we just got done watching this movie about this guy and all of this gold being loaded onto a ship that we just found, and they're just doing exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm. I guess I'm like one of the people that were kind of disappointed by this film. I don't think I was expecting much from it, but I wouldn't consider myself a fan. It was very dated, in my opinion, which was kind of weird, because like the end of the film, they put this like sound like Disturbed was on the soundtrack, or some hardcore metal band from the early 2000s. And it's just, I don't know, for some reason that like really like took me back to like, oh my gosh, this is like a kind of a dated film.
Mudvayne, that's who it was. It definitely has some of the stereotypical stuff from the certain areas that we've talked about before. It still has a little bit of the 90s feel to it, but then it also kind of has that whole, like we're saying, like kind of disaster movie feel to it. There was a lot of still crap that came out in the early 2000s that was left over from the 90s. But I don't know what it is about this movie, but this is one of those movies that, at least for myself, I would personally consider this movie definitely a beer and popcorn movie.
Yeah, I think I could put it in that category. It definitely wasn't something I'm going to go watch over and over and over again. I was kind of disappointed. I'm sort of like, I'm an old man now, so I think like I have a hard time with anything past 1989. So I'm very judgmental when it comes to films after that, and so it was like right at that phase where like the 90s were ending and we're entering into the 2000s, and I don't think Saw was out yet. I think Saw was like the first 21st century film that really, like, to me was like, okay, now horror is back. So everything, but I remember this film very specifically, like seeing. I remember like the trailers and like the TV spots and all that, and then like I didn't see it in the theater, but going to the video store way back in the early 2000s and renting it, and like because I was like desperate for a new horror film, watching it and being like, okay, it's this is what it is, and this is where we're at with horror. And it wasn't until like I said, Saw came out that I really felt like horror had returned to its to like a legitimate status or whatever. So I was. But I see what you're saying with like the whole beer and popcorn film, because that this definitely could be that.
I can see both sides of this one. So I can see to where some people are like, oh, it's a good like ghost story kind of thing. But then at the same time, even though I don't feel this way, I could see to where if you would compare it to like Anaconda or some of those movies, to where, I could see how you could go either way with this one. Like I said before, they had kind of the familiar names in the movie. And again, I don't think anybody's going to be watching this movie and be like, oh, hey, that's this person from this other thing. It's going to be one of those things where you're going to watch it and be like, oh, hey, I know that guy. I've seen him in something else before. And I liked it. I don't know what it is, but I liked it. The other thing that this movie, besides the opening scene with this movie, although some of the other scenes were cool, some of them were kind of, blah or whatever. Another thing that this movie did was, at least that I thought was cool, certain things it built up to a certain level of anticipation for you're like, oh man, I hope this person gets it or something. A lot of the stuff, at least for me, didn't really disappoint.
Okay.
There's, if that makes sense, because there's a couple of scenes where you're like, okay, so there's something's going to happen right now. Not that you're exactly expecting exactly what's going to happen, but like, okay, it's getting a little suspenseful. Something's going to be cool, going to happen. Oh man, that was pretty cool. And the thing that I keep thinking of when I watch this movie is, like you were talking about at the beginning of the movie, is, they're on the deck of this luxury cruise liner. There's this whatever kind of like Italian, like whatever you want to call it, band playing, and they have this like lounge singer singing, and it's this very attractive Italian woman. And I'm sure that I'm not the only guy. Again, horror movies are typically directed towards guys. You're watching this and you're like, oh, she's kind of cute. And then she comes back a little bit later on and you're like, oh yeah, she's kind of cute. And then there's one scene where she's like nude for no reason. I mean, there's a little bit of a reason, but you're like, hey, well, she doesn't have to be nude, but you're like, okay,
right,
that's not bad. And then it comes on later on that she's kind of like the mastermind behind this whole scheme. At least for me, anyway. I'm like, oh, something's gonna happen to her. Something's gonna happen to her. And then she gets a meat hook in her face, and you're like, that's cool. Again. Right. So you're like, there's a few moments in the movie that happens.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I can't say that I remember watching Anaconda and saying to myself ever throughout the entire movie, that's cool. Of course, Anaconda came out in 96, 97?
Yeah, I don't think I saw Anaconda.
Oh man, I saw Anaconda in the movie theater.
Did you really? Holy crap.
I did. Jennifer,
yeah.
I'm not a Jennifer Lopez fan at all.
Oh no. Yeah, I can't stand anything she's done. I hate to say that, but yeah, she's one of those actresses that just doesn't work for me.
I am a Jennifer Lawrence fan, though. I do like me some Jennifer Lawrence.
Hunger Games?
Yeah, those are all right.
Yeah, not bad, I guess, right?
The one movie where she's her and Bradley Cooper are dancing, whatever the movie that was, Silver Linings Playbook or whatever.
She was also in Mother, which I tried to get through some of it. I haven't gotten through it
I haven't watched
all
it
the way
yet.
through.
Although I know like the grotesque scene in it. But
Oh, I missed the grotesque scene.
you haven't watched it. You haven't seen it that far then yet, I guess.
Oh, okay.
So
Interesting.
I won't wreck it for you.
Ghost Ship is, when we say beer and popcorn films, there's, I think it does fall in that category, but it's a more modern beer and popcorn film, which I guess 15 years or 16 years, well, that's modern for me. I still think like Nirvana is like a brand new band when I think of like rock music. I'm like, oh yeah, the 90s, right? That's like what everybody's listening to these days. So I guess for me, it's like I'm a little bit dated here. So when I think beer and popcorn films, typically I'll pick like something like Critters or Hello, Mary Lou, Prom Night 2, something that didn't cross over into the 90s threshold yet. But this one did, 2002. This is kind of along the lines of like, what was that other films that came out around here? This is like Disturbing Behavior, maybe. Final Destination films. They were big around this time, I think. There's all that pre-torture porn era horror before like the next genre kind of took hold. Like, when we got the Saw films and the Hostel films and all that. I am a fan of Gabriel Byrne. I do like him. I was surprised he was in this movie. I didn't remember that from my original viewing, so that was kind of cool. To go ahead and review this film, I'm going to have to, I hate to say it, film a thumbs down.
Oh.
It was one of those movies where it was like I'm watching it and I'm like, I kept asking myself like, do I enjoy this? No, I don't. If I didn't have a Bud Light in my hand, would I watching? Probably not. So it was like one of those things where I had to endure it, and when you're watching a movie that you have to endure, that you're like, yeah, this isn't working. So yeah, I hate to say it. I will give it if we were to do a thumbs up for cover art, I would give it a huge thumbs up because the cover art for this film is phenomenal. But in terms of the film itself, it's like one of those movies kind of like, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of like an old, how about Up from the Depths? It's a terrible Jaws ripoff movie that came out in like the late 70s, early 80s. Had a really cool cover art. I remember as a kid renting it and then bringing it home, and it was like just absolutely terrible. So I would put it in like one of those categories where like the cover art's great, the movie's not so great.
Well, this is going to be one of those rare occasions here on Horror Heads that I go complete opposite of you. And I'm gonna give this one a thumbs up. I'm not gonna say huge thumbs up, but this is one of those movies. Like I said before, I think this is one of those guilty pleasure movies of mine.
Sure.
But it's just one of those ones, and I think a lot of it is, that opening scene is great. Mainly, I think it's more than anything, it's the kills. The storyline is, a little overdone in my experience. This is definitely one of those movies that I do enjoy. I think this is one of those ones where if somebody who wanted to see a horror movie but didn't necessarily want to, I don't want the blood and gore, even though you have that opening like slide kill scene, I think this is one of those ones that, you could show somebody and be like, oh, hey, here's this stupid early 2000s movie that's, storyline's not too bad. It's one of those movies you can have on and, whatever, if you're having a few drinks with somebody, but, you're like, oh, hey, check out this scene right here. This is a good one. Oh, yeah, that was cool. And then go back to whatever you're doing, reminiscing about 7th grade over a beer or something, kind of a movie.